Okay, hello Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to look at Amazon's Global Accelerator. So what is Global Accelerator? Well, it's a service in which you create accelerators to improve the availability and performance of your application for local and global users. And Global Accelerator directs traffic to optimal endpoints over the AWS global network. And this improves the availability and performance of your internet applications that are used by a global audience. By default, Global Accelerator gives you two static IP addresses that you associate with your accelerator. And alternatively, you can bring your own IP addresses. Let's go over to the AWS website and have a look at a diagram. Okay, so I'm on the AWS Global Accelerator landing page, and here you can see how it works. So you've got your user, and you've got traffic from your user's clients is being sent to the AWS Global Accelerator, and it's going via an edge location. So your user's traffic enters the AWS network at the closest edge location, and then AWS Global Accelerator directs traffic to the optimal endpoint based on proximity to the client, as well as health, and then endpoint weights. And we'll cover this all off in a few slides. So you've got these endpoint groups. They're associated with a particular AWS region, so US East 1, US West 1, etc. And we'll cover that off in a couple of slides. And then you've got your actual endpoints themselves. And this could be things like application load balancers or EC2 instances, etc. And so in terms of how it's better, I mean, this is the way you would access the website without Global Accelerator. So you've got your users, they're using their local ISP, and essentially it's using DNS to resolve a domain name. It's going across a whole bunch of different ISPs and backbone networks. It's all routed using BGP. Eventually, it hits the AWS region, and it's reliant on a whole bunch of other, providers. With Global Accelerator, you've got your users. They then connect to the AWS nearest edge point, which goes straight into the Global Accelerator and goes over Amazon's backbone network. So you're using the Amazon or the AWS network. So it's a lot more efficient than going across multiple ISPs, across multiple countries, etc. So Global Accelerator includes the following components. We've got our static IP addresses, which we've covered off already. Either AWS supplies them or you can bring your own. We then have our accelerator. When we set up our accelerator, we're going to get a DNS name. Got our network zone, our listener, our endpoint group, and then finally our endpoint, and we'll cover off each one. So let's start with the static IP addresses. Like I said, Global Accelerator provides you with two static IP addresses that you can associate with your accelerator, or you can bring your own. We then have our accelerator themselves, and an accelerator directs traffic to optimal endpoints over the AWS global network to improve the availability and performance of your internet applications. And each accelerator includes one or more listeners. When you create an accelerator, what's going to happen is it's going to assign you a default DNS name or domain name system, and it's going to be similar to this example. So I've just entered a random one, and then it's .awsglobalaccelerator.com. And that points to the static IP addresses that Global Accelerator assigns to you. And depending on the use case, you can use the accelerator's static IP addresses or DNS names to route traffic to your accelerator, or you can set up DNS records to route traffic using your own custom domain names as well. Then we've got our network zone, and our network zone services the static IP addresses for your accelerator from a unique IP subnet. So it's very similar to an AWS availability zone. A network zone is an isolated unit with its own set of physical infrastructure. So when you see network zone with Global Accelerator, I want you to just think of an availability zone. And when you configure an accelerator by default, Global Accelerator allocates two IPv4 addresses for it. If one IP address from a network zone becomes unavailable due to IP address blocking by certain client networks or network disruptions, client applications can retry on the healthy static IP address for the other isolated network zone. So if you lose one network zone, you can use the other IP address in another network zone. We then have our listener. A listener processes inbound connections from our clients to Global Accelerator based on the port or port ranges and protocols that you configure. And Global Accelerator obviously is going to support TCP and UDP protocols. And each listener has one or more endpoint groups associated with it, and then traffic is forwarded to the endpoints in one of the groups. and you associate endpoint groups with the listener by specifying the regions that you want to distribute the traffic to. And then traffic is distributed to optimal endpoints within the endpoint groups associated with the listener. And if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you, don't worry, we're going to cover this off in a lab in a couple of seconds. Our endpoint groups is, each endpoint group is associated with a specific AWS region, so it might be US East 1, US West 1, etc. Endpoint groups include one or more endpoints in the region, and you can increase or reduce the percentage of traffic that would otherwise be directed to an endpoint group by adjusting a setting called the traffic dial. If you have 100% traffic on one endpoint group, then 100% is going to go to that endpoint group. You might have 60% on one endpoint group and 40% on another, and these are traffic dials that you set, and that means 60% will go to one endpoint group, 40% will go to another endpoint group. The traffic dial lets you easily do performance testing or blue-green deployments testing for new releases across different AWS regions. And then we've got our endpoints, and our endpoints are simply things like network load balancers, application load balancers, EC2 instances, or elastic IP addresses. And an application load balancer endpoint can be internet-facing or it can be internal. And then traffic is routed to endpoints based on configuration options that you choose, such as endpoint weights. So you can have weighted endpoints as well. For each endpoint, you can configure weights, which are numbers that you can use to specify the proportion of traffic to each one. And this can be useful, for example, to do things like performance testing within a particular region. So if all this doesn't make a lot of sense, let's go ahead and deploy a global accelerator so you can get some hands-on experience, and then we'll go on to my exam tips. Okay, so here I am in the AWS console. Before we go over to Global Accelerator, the first thing we want to do is create an endpoint. And an endpoint can be our application load balancer or an EC2 instance, etc. So let's go over to EC2 and create an endpoint. So I'm going to just create an EC2 instance. I'm going to go and put it into US East 1. And let's go over and launch our instance. And I'm just going to do everything as default. So I'm going to use an Amazon Linux 2 AMI. I'm going to just do a T2 micro. I'm going to leave everything as default, add our storage, leave the tags, add our security group. I'm going to put this into my WebDMZ security group, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit launch. And that is now launching my EC2 instance. Now that we've done that, we now have an endpoint. So this is where our global accelerator is going to send all our traffic to. Now, let's go over and find Global Accelerator. Where do you think it would be? Well, if you said networking, you're absolutely correct. It is at the bottom of the networking and content delivery section right now. And you'll see here it actually opens up in a new tab when you click on that link. So this is Global Accelerator, and we can go ahead and create an accelerator. You'll see this landing page if you've never created one before. And in here, we just do our basic configuration, which is simply the accelerator name. So I'm going to call mine A Cloud Guru. I'm going to leave everything else as default. In here, we've got our IP address types. I'm going to leave it as IPv4. In here, this is where you bring your own IP addresses. We're not going to worry about that. Let's go ahead and hit next. In here, we can configure our listeners. So what port do we want to listen on? Well, we want to listen on port 80 and then 443, so HTTP and HTTPS. Protocol, UDP or TCP, we're going to do it on TCP. Client affinity, this is very much like sticky sessions with your elastic load balancers. Essentially what this does is if you have stateful applications, Global Accelerator can direct or request from a user at a specific client IP address range to the same endpoint resource to maintain client affinity. I'm just going to leave that as none and go ahead and hit next. In here, we've got our endpoint groups. So let's go in and add our region. So when we deployed our endpoint, we did it in US East 1. So I'm going to click in here. If you did want multiple endpoint groups, you could click in here and again, just add an additional endpoint group. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to send it all to US East 1. We can configure our health checks as well. I'm going to leave everything as default and go ahead and hit next. And in here, this is where we add our endpoint, so where we add our EC2 instance. So go ahead and click Add Endpoint. In here, we choose what we want. Do we want it to be an application load balancer, network load balancer, an EC2 instance, or an elastic IP? Or I want it to be an EC2 instance. In here, you should be able to see your EC2 instance. And in here, we've got our wait. Now, our wait is just our the endpoint wait. So just like how we could redirect traffic to particular endpoint groups, so you could do 60%, 40%, we can also do individual traffic to our individual endpoints as well. I'm just going to leave it as default as 128. So let's go ahead and hit Create Accelerator. And you can see that is now creating our accelerator. Straight away, we're assigned a static IP address or 2 static IP addresses, as well as our DNS name. And it really is as simple as that. That's how we create a global accelerator. It can take a couple of minutes to deploy, so I'm going to pause the video. Okay, let's do a refresh. Hopefully it's deployed, and you can see now the status has changed to deployed. In here, we can click into our endpoint and start changing our configurations. At the moment, the listeners are saying that this has a unhealthy status. Of course it does, because when we deployed that EC2 instance, we didn't turn it into a web server. We didn't create index.html. You can do that if you want. It's entirely up to you. And also we can go through and we can edit our configuration in here. Now, to delete our accelerator, all we need to do is click on our accelerators. First, we must disable it, then we delete it. So go ahead and just hit delete and disable your accelerator. This can take up to 5 minutes. I'm just going to pause the video, wait for it to be disabled. So my accelerator has now been disabled, and all I need to do is type in delete in here to go ahead and delete it. And there we go. It is now being deleted. If you go in and refresh it, you'll see that it says in progress, and then eventually it will disappear. Let's go over to my exam tips. So onto my exam tips. For the Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam, you basically just need to know what a global accelerator is and where you would use it. So Global Accelerator is a service which you create accelerators to improve availability and performance of your application for both local and global users. Remember that you always assign 2 static IP addresses, and alternatively, you can bring your own. And then you can control the traffic using traffic dials, and that's what we did in the lab, and that is done on the endpoint group itself. And you can also do traffic weighting on individual endpoints as well, so it's very highly configurable. So that is it for this lecture, everyone. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.